Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that welcome. I'm delighted to see you all today. Of course, we would have all liked it if we could hold this meeting in Hong Kong, but they had another visitor today. I notice he didn't stay for very long. He didn't even stay overnight in Hong Kong. Perhaps he's worried about intruders. But my wife suggested that the reason why he didn't stay longer in Hong Kong is that he didn't know the words to Glory to Hong Kong. I want to endorse all that Ben has said about Hong Kong Watch. It's played a really important part in making sure that people in this country and elsewhere know what is happening in a city, in a community that we all love. I was very struck by the headlines in newspapers both in this country and elsewhere. For example, in The Economist magazine this morning, which said that what we'd witnessed in Hong Kong was one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest, free societies in Asia being turned in a few years into a police state. That wasn't my way of describing it. It was the way that, for example, The Economist magazine described it, Wall Street Journal, others as well. And of course, they're correct. It would be risible, it would be laughable if we took seriously what President Xi had said about real democracy now coming to Hong Kong. I remember I recorded this in my diaries. I remember when one of the United Front activists in Hong Kong was giving evidence to the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And he explained to them, as he'd explained once to me, he said, "You don't understand. The Communist Party isn't against democracy. They just like to know the result in advance." Which is, of course, what happened with Mr. Lee, Police Constable Lee. Mr. Lee, who was allegedly elected, actually selected by a bunch of trustees, quislings, and elected not on a manifesto about the economy or social progress or education or health service in Hong Kong. He was chosen because he had been in charge of the police when they took such harsh measures against those who were demonstrating initially peacefully, for example, about the school curriculum, about more democracy, or about their opposition to the extradition treaty. And rather than try to talk to people, it was decided that the only way to react to those demonstrations, 2 million in the case of the extradition treaty, was to buy more tear gas, to secure more tasers, to get more plastic baton rounds. Terrible, terrible policing and a terrible way of trying to govern a peaceful, prosperous, stable community. I was asking last night one of the people who'd worked for me when I was in Hong Kong if he could remember the size of any demonstrations we had to face. And he said he thought there was once a demonstration of 100 people, maybe 200 people, about the quote, selection, unquote, of members of the provisional legislature. And he said he thought there was also a demonstration when unemployment went briefly above 2% on one occasion. But 2 million people on the streets, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. The other thing I noticed that President Xi said once again was that Hong Kong had to be run by patriots. Well, what does he think people like Anson Chan were? What does he think people like Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee were? The truth is that the Communist Party of China defines patriots like this. To be a patriot, you have to love the Communist Party. Tall order. When the communist stooges in Hong Kong were recently rewriting the school textbooks about the history of Hong Kong, they removed, as you know, any suggestion that Hong Kong had once been a British colony. And I have never, ever done anything but to criticize the terms in which Hong Kong became a British colony. But they said it had never been a British colony. It was simply an occupied territory. And I wonder if they ever think through what that really means and how it relates to the point about being patriots. Because who occupied Hong Kong? Who made it such a success story? The people who occupied Hong Kong were overwhelmingly refugees and the family of refugees from communism on the mainland. People like Jimmy Lai, who stowed away aged 12. Others, many of you and your families. The population of Hong Kong at the time of the communist takeover in the mainland was about 600,000. Overwhelmingly, Hong Kong consisted of people who were refugees from the Great Leap Forward, from the Great Famine, when some people in the mainland were driven to cannibalism, from the Cultural Revolution. All those events which we're now supposed to forget. Just as you're not allowed to take part in a vigil, even hold a candle on the 4th of June to remember the people who were killed in Tiananmen Square. One of my best friends in Hong Kong was a journalist called Jonathan Mirsky. Now, he was not an easy friend. I've never known anybody who was more likely to storm out of a dinner party or a meeting angry at what he'd heard other people say. He was what is sometimes called feisty. And he had reason to be. He'd started off as a fan of Mao, but the more he saw of communism, the more he disliked it. And he was in Beijing for the Observer newspaper in 1989. And he was in the middle of a crowd of students, young kids, and they were calling him Grandpa. And they started hearing the rattle of gunfire. And one of the kids said to him, "Don't worry, Grandpa, they're using rubber bullets." And as the kid said that, he dropped dead at Mirsky's feet, covering him with blood, with a great red hole in the middle of his forehead. You can't pretend that those things didn't happen. You can't pretend that the bad things in history didn't happen. You can't rewrite your own narrative, especially when the people you're trying to convince of a different narrative were all part of the original story and know themselves what happened. So what's happened in Hong Kong? My main critic when I was governor was a British diplomat called Sir Percy Craddock. Yes. And Sir Percy Craddock gave me and others one piece of advice. He said the communist leaders, these were his words, not mine. I'm much more diplomatic than that. He said the communist leaders, he said, may be thuggish dictators, but they are men of their word. So the implication was, the explicit observation was, that having signed the international treaty, which guaranteed one country, two systems for 50 years, high degree of autonomy, having once signed that, they'd keep to it. We know what's happened. We know what happened to their signature on the international health regulations after the first coronavirus outbreak, or the original coronavirus, in 2003. We know what's happened with the fortification of atolls and islands in the South China Sea. We know what's happened in Xinjiang. And the truth of the matter is, they can't be trusted. People used to use two avian metaphors about Hong Kong. Some people used to say, the Chinese can't possibly tamper with Hong Kong. It's a golden goose, and they don't want to slaughter the goose. Well, as China's got richer, I think they've cared less about that. And anyway, they want Hong Kong, they don't want Hong Kongers. That's where the Chinese Communist Party are. But there was another avian metaphor which people used to talk about. And that was that the way that the Communist Party of China handled Hong Kong would tell us a great deal about what they would be like as a power in the world. People said that Hong Kong was the canary down the mine. You know what they used to say about the canary, which would make clear that there was air down the mine, so the miners could continue to work there. Truth to tell, they've throttled the canary. They've attacked not just Democrats. They've attacked the rule of law, allowing the national security law to seep into the common law. Why do people wait for so long for a trial without bail? Why no bail? They attack freedom of the press. Jimmy Lai and others, but Jimmy Lai is a particular target, not only because he showed what a refugee from mainland China could do in Hong Kong, but also because he had the guts to stay behind. He could have, at any moment, he could have gone to Taiwan, or here, or America, or Canada. But he stayed behind because he wanted to show that he wasn't frightened of them. And they hate that. They're trying to turn the education of kids into what Stalinists used to call engineering of the soul. They've even been putting pressure on the churches. Why did the police last year start taking photographs of people going in and out of Mass at the time of the June the 4th vigils? And the list goes on. All made possible by a group of people who I think are sometimes seduced by greed and sometimes, unfortunately, seem to have very few moral standards at all. What is wonderful is that you and the overwhelming majority of people in Hong Kong have standards. I've never had to be as brave, never, as people in Hong Kong have had to be. And it gives me, this isn't mock, I'm not making this up. It gives me a profound sense of where my place is in all this. How I'm lucky to be identified with you. How I'm lucky to be identified with enormously gutsy people who've stood up for the values which I can take for granted. But I can only take them for granted in the years that lie ahead if we go on remembering Hong Kong and remembering the values which Hong Kong represents. It's a point which Ai Weiwei has made, which I quote in my book. So what's going to happen? Who knows? But I have this sense that totalitarianism, when it melts like that. A friend of mine was in Berlin. He was a minister in 1989. And the day he was there, a kid was shot swimming across the canal from east to west. And my friend, who'd been told just before he left for Berlin that there'd never be a change in Germany in his lifetime. My friend says to his officials, "We've got to protest about this. This is terrible." And they said, "I wouldn't do that, Minister." It was like that Yes Minister program. "I wouldn't do that, Minister. It'd be a very brave thing to do, but not very wise. We have better ways of dealing with East Berlin authorities, East Germany." Well, as my friend said, within 2-3 weeks, there was no wall, there was no East Berlin, there was no East Germany. All swept into the ash can of history. And one last thought before I pipe down and give you a chance of asking a few questions, before we get on with the business of seeing if I can still remember what my name is. My favorite is the wrong way of putting it. The book that's made the most impact on me is a book by an Austrian Jewish intellectual from Vienna, who wrote a book called The World of Yesterday. And he writes in it a wonderful description of European civilization at the beginning of the last century. And he describes as a Jew how that was steadily ripped apart by fascism in the 1920s and 30s. And as a Jew, terrified about what might happen to him and his wife, he fled Austria and found refuge in Britain, and then in America, and then in Brazil. And he wrote this book, The World of Yesterday, in which he describes his horror at seeing the night falling on Europe and wickedness in Europe. And he wrote this book and sent it off to his publisher. And the following day, he and his wife committed suicide because he couldn't imagine how the world that he'd taken for granted, this wonderful civilization, could possibly be resurrected. Now that was before the 1C conference in 1942 in Germany plotted and planned the murder of 6 million Jews. So if he'd written it a bit later, he might have been even gloomier. So what would he have thought if he hadn't committed suicide about the way that Europe, this continent, was resurrected, was rebuilt from the ashes in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and so on. So that I'm one of those who was born at the very end of the Second World War. My wife also, but her father was killed before she was born. My best friend at school was a Polish boy whose father was killed in the Battle of Monte Cassino. And people could never have imagined at that time that we'd then enjoy 50, 60, 70 years of extraordinary peace and prosperity. So things do change. But in order for them to change, there have to be people who have the guts, the courage to stand up for what's decent and what is right and what is good. And how we behave towards Hong Kong is an example, will be an example, of how much we're able to go on arguing the case for decency in the world. So you didn't choose to be in this position, but I think you're right at the heart of the debates, the arguments which are going to decide what the 21st century is like. So glory to Hong Kong, indeed, and glory to Hong Kongers. You made a great city, and God willing, one day it'll be great and free again. I can take some questions.